All right, well, welcome week 4. It's good to see you guys. We're talking about sermon forms and outlines. That is to say, the way that we organize our content. Last week we talked about expository and topical sermons. This week we're going to follow on with that conversation and finish it by talking about narrative sermons. In week 4's lesson portal on Blackboard, you can click on a couple of PDFs. There's 2 PDFs and 1 PowerPoint presentation, all of which deal with effectively narrative preaching and the form and sort of more detailed content. But do be aware as you're going through that, and I would encourage you to go through it carefully and really pick up on the different dimensions of subtlety related to narrative. For this reason, be aware that narrative preaching is more than just telling a story per se, meaning that obviously the term narrative means story or to narrate or narrate. Narrative preaching, though, has at least 3 different primary forms, and then you can have 4 or 5 or 6 variations or more on those themes. And so it's important to realize that the first of the 3 forms that are typically used today, the most common probably and well-known and predictable, is where you've got a classic expository topical message and you're inserting illustrations or stories within that. That's kind of your classical narrative component part delivery of story or illustration. And that's, again, one of 3 major ways that narrative shows up these days in sermons or sermonizing. The second way is through telling the story of the Scripture through the Scripture. That is to say, either in a single delivery or message or in a series, either verbatim, that is reading right out of the Scripture, or more in a sort of summary synopsis way, or a combination of both. So that, for instance, on the one hand, you may be looking at the prodigal son, the parable of the prodigal son, and you literally read through and then walk people through that as the sermon. Or maybe something a little bit longer, like Joseph's life from the book of Genesis, and either read portions or all of, or summarize or a combination thereof, and tell that story, that one being, because it's a little longer, more conducive to several installments, that is a series of sermons rather than one, although I've heard it actually done as you have probably both ways. So telling the stories of the Bible through the Bible, in part, in whole, verbatim, or in summary, or a combination thereof, is the second of 3 ways that narrative shows up in sermons these days. And the third is actually a little bit more subtle. It's the designing of the sermon like or in the template of a story, and or overlaying a story of some kind on that template. So in other words, and it's in your notes, so you can look at it in the PDFs and the PowerPoint, but you can use the elements of story up to and including the resolution as a kind of guiding template for your sermon itself. Whether you tell a story or not, that's a narrative sermon. More likely than not, you'll have some kind of story overlay. So an example would be, hey, I want to tell you about my trip to Russia for a ministry conference and the 3 things I learned there, or some such, where you're actually narrating a series of events, could be actual or fictional, and you're drawing from that narrative, points of application for your listeners, as it were, right out of the elements of story, so that the framework of the sermon itself has the elements, again, you'll find those in the PowerPoint and in other places in the content this week, of story itself. There's 6 or 7 major component parts of what makes a story, and whether you're writing it or telling it or what have you, you can use those as the framework. So those are your 3 ways that narrative shows up. You can combine those. You can riff on all of that 1,000 different ways, really, and I've heard people do it a lot of different ways. But in utilizing story, you've got a very powerful form, a very memorable form of communication that is readily available, and that is really primarily, although there are many genres in the Bible and many types of literature in the Bible being 66 books, so in effect, not really a book itself, more like a library, right, of 66 different works. Within all those 66 books, there's a ton of different types of genre. There's history, there's, essay, there's poetry, there's apocalyptic literature. I mean, on and on it goes, right? So, sort of tapping into the natural narrative nature of the Bible itself is in part what makes story and narrative preaching so powerful. Another reason it's so powerful is that we're built for stories. I mean, obviously, movies, novels, short stories, jokes, a lot of the way that we communicate is in some kind of story form. And so there's a natural inclination toward it and a natural curiosity for it, meaning that human beings love stories and love to hear and share stories. I have a grandson now who's 3 years old, and he's all about story. He's all about, tell me about this and let me tell you about that. And everything that comes out of his mouth virtually is in story form of one kind or another these days. So it just shows you that it's foundational to human nature and super powerful. A couple of things to remember about beyond what I've just said about the strength of story. Most of Scripture is a form of story. The 66 books held together was one meta-narrative story of the reality of human history, with Jesus Christ as the central character throughout Old and New Testaments, right? So you've got a huge story form there. Genre itself demands attention and meaning and a kind of following through, again, of the template of a narrative. Oftentimes, even if you're teaching through portions of Scripture like the Psalms, you're telling stories, or at least backstories, about how this psalm or song got written. Same with Proverbs, same with the prophetic literature. Story is just all the way throughout the Bible in so many ways at so many levels that it commends the use of narrative preaching naturally. Another thing that you have to realize about story is that not only are stories intrinsically memorable, which is important because, there's all kinds of statistics, right, about public speaking and sermonizing. Probably more dramatically true today. The number's higher today than ever before because of people's shrinking attention spans, but, different statistics like 90% of what you say people won't remember in 10 minutes, or the reality that they'll remember what you wore or how you moved, your body language a week after they witness or hear a sermon or message that you've delivered, and they won't remember anything about what you actually said. That the most powerful communication is not words themselves or content. On and on these stats go. When it comes to narrative form, there is a natural set of attractant hooks within narrative that I want to point out to you, that if you're a fan of stories like I am, and literature and so on, just for fun and entertainment and personal enrichment, you realize are very effective. So example, colorful characters, memorable dramatic plot lines. More basic, the reality that every good story raises questions that the author does not answer immediately, creating tension. Mystery novels are blatantly, effective at this, and all stories, all genres of story, use this in one degree or another, or at least somewhat indirectly, say, in the use of two characters who come together on the page and don't get along and have conflict. That's a way of raising questions. What's going on? Why are they, tense? Who's whose issues, are on the table here? What's really going on between these two people? You and I like to have life go, I hope, smoothly, calmly, without conflict, and that's quote unquote normal life. But story life, narrative life, is filled with conflict, and the best stories are always, filled with all kinds of and multiple layers of conflict. Oftentimes, this conflict itself raising questions that are not immediately answered. Now, there's an art and a science to that. You don't want to string people out with unanswered questions and just drive them crazy by stirring up their curiosity without some sort of satisfaction, because that will haunt you in the end and destroy your story. The satisfaction, indeed, of a story is the fulfillment and answering of various questions in their right moment and through their right unveiling or unfolding in the character, interaction and plot of the actual storyline itself. But that technique, and many related to it, is worth really carefully considering, doing a good, solid study on what it means to write well in fictional, story-driven ways. Reading poetry, reading short stories, reading fables and mythology, getting a sense of the rhythms of story can only help your preaching, massively, because the way that people apprehend thoughts and information and unfolding drama is there for your exploiting in the best possible sense. Having said all that, human nature is geared towards story. We talked about that. The scripture itself is filled with story. Even though many people say that story has sort of gone by the wayside in our digital, social media-driven age, it's really not true. It's been abbreviated and in many ways modified, but it's certainly central to all that we do, and it's culturally relevant always. And so whenever you tell a story, even if it's a story about ancient people, the very placing of content from the ancient world in a story makes it a whole lot more accessible. And then humor itself, which always brightens a message, makes it more fun, just makes it more easily accessible, breaks down barriers and walls and filters with people. Humor itself is story. I mean, you think about your best jokes, they're little stories, So learning, how to form a joke is really in a certain profound way learning the basics of storytelling. Timing is everything with a joke, as it is in story, as it is in sermonizing or developing and delivering a message. So all those things are really key. A few creative examples I could offer you to stimulate your imagination. Again, read good literature, read good stories, read good genre novels, mysteries, detective stories, romances. Try to pick good quality, although, anything that's written well enough to be a bestseller is employing the kinds of techniques we're talking about. So you don't have to be highbrow to appreciate, the craft of communication in the sense that I'm talking about it. One of my favorite storytellers, although evangelicals, for good reason, are not terribly excited about him anymore, but one of my favorite storytellers as a sermonizer back in the day was Rob Bell. He's drifted theologically quite a bit, and I haven't even kept up with him myself, so I can't make meaningful commentary, but there's no better storyteller in verbal communication in the late modern era than somebody like Rob Bell. There are many as good as him, but controversial as it might be, don't pay attention to his theology, but definitely pay attention to him on YouTube or somewhere else telling a story. And one of the things that he specialized in, again, back in the day, we're talking about years ago now, but was telling sort of the personal narrative, almost a journal-like story, of his own feelings and experiences. I remember he did one little segment on grief that was just quite powerful because it was vulnerable and transparent and real and human and a story. So read good poetry. Poetry is very helpful in many ways. Not the least of which is helping you in your thought process to be efficient and compact and vivid. Poetry itself is, by design, short, usually brief, compact, powerful imagery, a hyper efficiency in language and words. Less is more. I wish, excuse me, many preachers these days would understand the dynamic of less is more. We'd all save a lot of energy and benefit tremendously if they did. Another way to tell stories is with media, music lyrics, or movie clips. Recently, I went to a Christmas Eve service at a church that I've attended from time to time just to drop in and see how they're doing. It's a really high production church, and again, not sounding or wanting to sound critical. It's not the place that I would necessarily land or plug into, but it's a little bit like David Letterman show on steroids. Their production values are very high, the speaker's very effective, all that kind of good stuff. Gospel's a little thin, but in this particular service, he used the movie Polar Express. The speaker used the movie Polar Express as a kind of framing narrative for his message, and it was outstanding gospel core to the message. Just a vivid, media-driven presentation that was, because it was narrative, so powerful. It wasn't just the media. Polar Express is an interesting film if you've not seen it or you have kids who've seen it. But the point was that the way the story of the gospel was interwoven into a sort of central punchline from that movie, which went something like, what do you do when the magic ends? The magic is over. There's a scene and a theme that framed that really well. It was great. It was just really powerful communication. So, with some good content, obviously, which is key. So, again, song lyrics, music videos. You may not want to use Billie Eilish or something like that. Make some people uncomfortable in church. But picking and choosing carefully your content. Anything in that realm can be good. There's various ways. But think story, think narrative, think the power of story to communicate, and you'll be good. And utilize this form well. So good luck with it. Hope you enjoy it. Preaching a sermon in story form, I'll finish with this thought, is really a lot of fun. When you've got a sermon that follows a storyline, it can be a lot of fun to preach. So it takes kind of the work out of what is otherwise a lot of hard work. So, all right. Thanks for watching.